Margaret Calloway sat in the third row of her husband's funeral with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on a single scratch in the hardwood floor. Not because she was cold. Not because she didn't love him. But because if she looked up, at the flowers she hadn't chosen, at the photographs she hadn't been asked about, at the family who had organized every detail of burying her own husband without once picking up the phone to call her, she knew she would fall apart completely, and she had made herself a quiet promise that she would not give them that. Not today. Not in this room. Gerald Calloway had been gone for 11 days when his family finally told Margaret about the will reading. 11 days. She found out through a text message from her sister-in-law Diane. 3 lines, a date, a time, an address. No greeting. No signature. Just information delivered the way you'd send directions to someone you'd hired to clean your house. Margaret read it twice, set her phone face down on the kitchen counter, and stood there in the silence of a home that still smelled faintly like her husband's coffee, wondering how a woman could be married for 31 years and still be treated like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. The lawyer's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that had clearly been designed to make ordinary people feel small. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs, a receptionist who smiled without warmth. Margaret arrived 7 minutes early and sat alone in the waiting room while Gerald's brother, his 2 sisters, and 4 of their adult children filled every other chair and spoke loudly about things that had nothing to do with grief. They talked about the lake house. They talked about the cars. Diane mentioned more than once that she had always loved the antique clock in Gerald's study. Nobody spoke to Margaret. Nobody offered her water. One of the nephews looked at her once, briefly, the way you look at furniture you're trying to decide whether to keep. When they finally filed into the conference room and the lawyer, a composed, silver-haired man named Arthur Pendleton, began to read, Margaret noticed something she couldn't quite name at the time. He read calmly, efficiently, methodically. The lake house went to Gerald's brother. The investment accounts were split between the sisters. The vehicles, the personal collections, the jewelry that Margaret had watched Gerald inherit from his own mother, all of it distributed with the clean precision of a man reading a grocery list. The family leaned forward with each line. Someone exhaled with satisfaction. Someone else actually smiled. And then Arthur Pendleton paused. He looked down at the paper. He looked up, and for just a fraction of a second, his eyes found Margaret's, and something passed across his face that she couldn't read. Then he said it. To my wife, Margaret and Calloway, I leave the sum of $20. The room didn't erupt. It was worse than that. It rippled. A sound moved through Gerald's family like a current. Quiet laughter, quickly covered. A cough that wasn't a cough. Diane leaned sideways toward her daughter and whispered something behind her hand, and her daughter pressed her lips together to hold back a smile and failed. $20. 31 years. $20. Margaret did not cry. She did not speak. She stared straight ahead and breathed, and in her peripheral vision she saw Arthur Pendleton close the folder, slowly, deliberately, and she noticed that he did not look relieved the way everyone else in the room did. He looked like a man who was waiting, like someone who knew that the meeting that actually mattered hadn't started yet. And he was right. Margaret Calloway sat in the third row of her husband's funeral with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on a single scratch in the hardwood floor. Not because she was cold. Not because she didn't love him. But because if she looked up, at the flowers she hadn't chosen, at the photographs she hadn't been asked about, at the family who had organized every detail of burying her own husband without once picking up the phone to call her, she knew she would fall apart completely, and she had made herself a quiet promise that she would not give them that. Not today. Not in this room. Gerald Calloway had been gone for 11 days when his family finally told Margaret about the will reading. 11 days. She found out through a text message from her sister-in-law Diane. 3 lines, a date, a time, an address. No greeting. No signature. Just information delivered the way you'd send directions to someone you'd hired to clean your house. Margaret read it twice, set her phone face down on the kitchen counter, and stood there in the silence of a home that still smelled faintly like her husband's coffee, wondering how a woman could be married for 31 years and still be treated like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. The lawyer's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that had clearly been designed to make ordinary people feel small. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs, a receptionist who smiled without warmth. Margaret arrived 7 minutes early and sat alone in the waiting room while Gerald's brother, his 2 sisters, and 4 of their adult children filled every other chair and spoke loudly about things that had nothing to do with grief. They talked about the lake house. They talked about the cars. Diane mentioned more than once that she had always loved the antique clock in Gerald's study. Nobody spoke to Margaret. Nobody offered her water. One of the nephews looked at her once, briefly, the way you look at furniture you're trying to decide whether to keep. When they finally filed into the conference room and the lawyer, a composed, silver-haired man named Arthur Pendleton, began to read, Margaret noticed something she couldn't quite name at the time. He read calmly, efficiently, methodically. The lake house went to Gerald's brother. The investment accounts were split between the sisters. The vehicles, the personal collections, the jewelry that Margaret had watched Gerald inherit from his own mother, all of it distributed with the clean precision of a man reading a grocery list. The family leaned forward with each line. Someone exhaled with satisfaction. Someone else actually smiled. And then Arthur Pendleton paused. He looked down at the paper. He looked up, and for just a fraction of a second, his eyes found Margaret's, and something passed across his face that she couldn't read. Then he said it. To my wife, Margaret and Calloway, I leave the sum of $20. The room didn't erupt. It was worse than that. It rippled. A sound moved through Gerald's family like a current. Quiet laughter, quickly covered. A cough that wasn't a cough. Diane leaned sideways toward her daughter and whispered something behind her hand, and her daughter pressed her lips together to hold back a smile and failed. $20. 31 years. $20. Margaret did not cry. She did not speak. She stared straight ahead and breathed, and in her peripheral vision she saw Arthur Pendleton close the folder, slowly, deliberately, and she noticed that he did not look relieved the way everyone else in the room did. He looked like a man who was waiting, like someone who knew that the meeting that actually mattered hadn't started yet. And he was right. There is a particular kind of pain that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't arrive with tears or raised voices. It arrives quietly, in the background of an ordinary moment, and it settles into your chest like something permanent. Margaret Calloway discovered this on a Tuesday afternoon, in the parking lot of Arthur Pendleton's office building, standing next to a car she had driven herself because nobody had thought to ask if she needed a ride. The family had moved quickly. That was the first thing she noticed. Before Arthur had even finished gathering his folders, Gerald's brother Raymond had his phone out, already texting someone. Diane was speaking in a low, animated voice to her daughter about renovation timelines. The lake house, apparently, needed a new deck, and now that the question of ownership was settled, there was no reason to wait. The energy in that conference room had shifted the moment the will reading ended, transforming from a gathering of grieving relatives into something that felt uncomfortably close to a planning meeting. Gerald had been in the ground for less than 2 weeks. The coffee from the reception table was still warm. Margaret had stood, gathered her coat, and walked toward the door. Nobody stopped her. Nobody said goodbye. One of Gerald's nephews, the one who had looked at her like furniture earlier, stepped aside to let her pass with the mechanical courtesy of someone holding a door for a stranger. As she moved through the reception area and pressed the elevator button, she heard laughter break out behind her from the conference room. Genuine, relaxed, relieved laughter. The kind that fills a room when something stressful has finally been resolved. She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. She rode down 4 floors in complete silence and walked out into the gray afternoon air and stood beside her car and breathed. She didn't cry then either. She had moved somewhere beyond crying, into a quieter, more hollow place where emotions don't perform themselves but simply sit with you, heavy and wordless. $20. She kept returning to it, not with anger, but with a kind of exhausted bewilderment. 31 years of a life built alongside another person, and the legal document that summarized her worth to that life was smaller than what she'd spend on groceries tomorrow. She unlocked her car. She put her handbag on the passenger seat. She sat there for a long moment with her hands in her lap. And then her phone buzzed. A message from Diane, sent to what was apparently a family group chat that Margaret had not known existed until this moment, because she had never been added to it. Diane had accidentally included her, or perhaps hadn't checked who was on the thread, and the message was a string of celebration emojis followed by the words, "Dinner at Raymond's tonight. We finally get what we always deserved." Below it, a cascade of responses. Hearts. Champagne glasses. Someone had already sent a photograph of the lake house with a question mark and a paintbrush emoji. Margaret stared at her phone screen for a long time. Then she closed the message thread, set the phone face down on the passenger seat beside her handbag, and was about to start the car when she noticed something she had missed in the blur of leaving the building. There was a plain white card sitting on top of her handbag. Small, cream-colored, no logo. Just a name, Arthur Pendleton, and a handwritten line beneath the printed number that said simply, "Please call before Friday. It is important that you do." She didn't remember him placing it there. She couldn't recall a moment when he'd been close enough. But it was there, and the handwriting was deliberate, and the word important had been underlined once, not twice, not pressed hard into the paper dramatically, just once, with the calm certainty of a man who already knew she would make the right decision. She picked up the card. She read it 3 more times. Then she started the car and drove home, and for the first time since Gerald died, she felt something other than grief. She felt a question forming. Have you ever stood at the edge of a decision so small it seemed almost embarrassing to hesitate over? A phone call, a single conversation, 2 minutes of your time, and felt something in you pull back anyway, as if some quiet instinct was warning you that picking up that phone would change the geography of your life in ways you couldn't yet see. Margaret Calloway stood in her kitchen on Wednesday morning with Arthur Pendleton's card in one hand and her phone in the other, and she almost didn't call. The hesitation wasn't fear exactly. It was closer to exhaustion. She had spent the last 2 weeks making decisions under the weight of grief. What flowers, which readings, who to notify, how to respond to condolences from people she barely knew with grace she barely had. Every conversation felt like it required something from her that she was running out of. Another phone call, another voice, another exchange that would demand she be present and composed and functional. Part of her simply wanted to set the card down on the counter and make tea and sit in Gerald's chair by the window and do absolutely nothing for the rest of the day. The world would not stop if she waited. Friday was still 2 days away. But she looked at that underlined word again. Important. Not urgent. Not pressing. Important. There was a distinction in that choice, and she felt it without being able to fully articulate it. Urgent was what Diane's text messages were. Urgent was the family's scramble to claim and divide and celebrate. Important was something slower, something with more weight, something that didn't need to shout because it already knew its own value. She dialed before she finished the thought. Arthur Pendleton answered on the second ring, which surprised her. She had expected a receptionist, a hold, the bureaucratic cushioning of a busy professional schedule. Instead, his voice came through calm and immediate, as if he had been expecting the call not just today, but at this specific hour. He asked how she was. She said fine, because it was the only answer she had that didn't require explanation. He said he was glad she called, and the way he said it carried something underneath. Not sympathy exactly, more like quiet satisfaction, the way a person sounds when something they carefully arranged has begun to move in the right direction. He told her he couldn't discuss details over the phone. She asked why. He said that what he needed to show her required her presence, and that some things lose their meaning when they're reduced to words in a conversation. She found that unusual enough to pause on. Lawyers, in her limited experience, communicated almost exclusively through words. The fact that this one was telling her words weren't sufficient made the question inside her grow sharper and more insistent. She asked if this was about the estate. He said it was connected to the estate, yes. She asked if she needed to bring anything, and this was the moment that genuinely stopped her cold. He said, "Your marriage certificate. Original copy if you have it. And please, don't mention this call to anyone in the family." She stood very still in her kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed slowly on the wet street. She processed what he just said and felt the pieces of it arrange themselves into a shape she couldn't fully identify yet, but it had edges, and it had weight, and whatever it was real. She asked him directly why the family couldn't know. His answer was measured and precise. "Because this appointment is for you, Mrs. Calloway. Not for them." She wrote down the time. Thursday, 10 o'clock. She was to wait outside her home. He would collect her personally. She hung up, set the phone on the counter, and stood there in the hum of her quiet kitchen with her marriage certificate already forming in her mind. Third drawer, left side, green folder, exactly where Gerald had always insisted important documents should live. Gerald, who had apparently been keeping something important of his own. What is it about a secret kept by someone you loved that feels so different from a secret kept by someone who betrayed you? One hollows you out with suspicion. The other fills you with something stranger, a peculiar mixture of hurt and wonder and the unsettling realization that the person you thought you knew completely had depths you never reached. Margaret Calloway understood, standing on her front porch at 9:58 on a Thursday morning with her marriage certificate in her handbag and the autumn air sharp against her face, that she was about to find out which kind of secret Gerald had kept. Arthur Pendleton arrived exactly at 10. Not approximately, not within a reasonable window, exactly. A dark navy sedan, understated and clean, pulled to the curb with the quiet precision of someone who had planned this moment down to its smallest detail. He stepped out, walked around to open the passenger door, and greeted her with a nod that managed to be both professional and genuinely warm. No small talk about the weather. No performative condolences. Just, "Thank you for trusting me, Mrs. Calloway. I know that wasn't a small thing." She got in. The door closed. And for the first time in 2 weeks, Margaret Calloway was moving, physically, literally moving, in a direction nobody in Gerald's family knew about. She noticed within the first 10 minutes that they were heading out of the city. Not to a satellite office, not to a different branch of some legal firm, but out, past the commercial sprawl, past the suburban grids of identical houses with identical mailboxes, past the last gas station that marked the unofficial border between urban life and something older and quieter. She watched the landscape change through the passenger window and said nothing, because Arthur Pendleton had the particular quality of stillness that makes questions feel premature. He was not withholding information cruelly. He was delivering it at the pace it deserved. After about 40 minutes, she asked where they were going. He told her they were heading to a property approximately 2 hours from the city. She asked whose property. He said, "Yours, as of 11 days ago." She turned to look at him directly then, and he kept his eyes on the road, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one, the expression of a man carrying something he's looked forward to setting down for a very long time. The questions came then, not in a flood but in a careful sequence, because Margaret was not a woman who panicked. She asked how long he had known Gerald. 14 years, he said. She asked if Gerald had come to him alone to arrange whatever this was. He had, Arthur confirmed, always alone, always by appointment, always with a specific instruction that nothing be documented in any file accessible to the broader estate paperwork. She absorbed this. 14 years. Gerald had been building something in a quiet parallel to their daily life for 14 years, and she had made his coffee every morning and folded his shirts and known nothing about it. The hurt of that was real. She didn't dismiss it. But underneath the hurt was something that kept pushing upward, the memory of a man who underlined words once instead of twice, who reached for her hand out of habit, who noticed things before they were spoken. Gerald Calloway did not do anything carelessly. If he had kept this from her, there was a reason. She just didn't know it yet. The landscape outside had gone fully rural now, open fields giving way to dense treelines, the road narrowing incrementally as though it was gradually becoming something more private. She noticed there were no road signs she recognized, no landmarks she could place. Her phone showed 2 bars of signal, dropping to 1. She was, in the most literal sense, being taken somewhere unknown by someone she had met twice in formal settings, carrying a document that proved she had once promised her life to a man she was beginning to realize she hadn't fully known. And the strangest part, the part she would think about long afterward, was that she wasn't afraid. She was something else entirely. She was awake in a way she hadn't been in years. There are moments in a life that divide everything cleanly into before and after. Not the loud moments, not the weddings or the funerals or the announcements made in crowded rooms. The quiet ones. The ones that arrive without fanfare, in the middle of an ordinary action, and split your understanding of everything you thought you knew directly down the center. For Margaret Calloway, that moment came at the end of an unmarked private road, in front of a pair of iron gates she had never seen before, on a Thursday morning that had begun like any other Thursday morning in the 2 weeks since her world had ended. Arthur slowed the car as the treeline thickened on both sides of the road, the branches overhead knitting together into a canopy that filtered the light into something softer and more diffused. The road itself had changed character gradually, from asphalt to packed gravel, from gravel to a smoother private surface that suggested maintenance and intention. This was not an accident of geography. Someone had designed this approach deliberately, had chosen this particular density of trees and this particular quality of road surface and this particular sense of gradual enclosure. Someone had wanted the arrival to feel like a transition, like passing through something. The gates appeared around a long curve, and Margaret's breath caught, not dramatically, not with a gasp, but with the small involuntary stillness of someone whose expectations have just been quietly demolished. They were tall, wrought iron, set between 2 stone pillars that had the dark, weathered permanence of something built to outlast the people who commissioned it. There was no nameplate, no address number, no intercom panel or security camera visible from the road. Just the gates, the pillars, and beyond them, a private driveway curving away through more trees towards something she couldn't yet see. Arthur stopped the car, reached into his jacket pocket, and produced a single old-fashioned key on a plain ring. He stepped out, unlocked a small mechanism set into the left pillar that she hadn't noticed, and the gates swung inward with a smooth, weighted movement of something very well maintained. He returned to the car, pulled through, and stopped again to close them behind. She watched in the side mirror as the iron gates swung shut, and the sound they made, a deep, resonant clang that faded slowly into the surrounding trees, felt less like a closing and more like a sealing. Like something being confirmed. She asked him then, because she couldn't hold it any longer, how this property existed without her knowledge. He navigated the curving driveway carefully before answering. Gerald, he explained, had purchased this land 22 years ago through a private holdings arrangement that was structured specifically to exist outside the visible record of his personal assets. It was legal, properly documented, and entirely invisible to anyone who hadn't been told where to look. Including, and he said this with a careful gentleness, the family. Including, until now, her 22 years. Margaret did the arithmetic without meaning to. 22 years ago, she and Gerald had been 9 years into their marriage. Their life together had already been fully built. The house, the routines, the quiet rhythms of two people who had chosen each other and settled into that choice with comfort and certainty. And somewhere in the middle of that ordinary, familiar life, Gerald had done something extraordinary and told nobody. Arthur brought the car to a stop, and Margaret looked up through the windshield and saw the house for the first time. But before she could fully process what she was seeing, Arthur turned to her and said the sentence that would stay with her longer than anything else that happened that day. Longer than the gates, longer than the drive, longer than whatever waited inside. He said, "Gerald told me that when you finally saw this, you would understand everything. He said you were the only person who ever would." She stared at the house. The house stared back. And somewhere in the back of her mind, 31 years of small, quiet moments began rearranging themselves into a shape she was only now beginning to recognize. There is a difference between a house and a home, and most people understand it instinctively. A house is a structure, a home is an accumulation, the slow deposit of a life lived deliberately inside four walls. Margaret Calloway had understood this difference for 31 years. What she had not understood, until she stepped out of Arthur Pendleton's car on a quiet Thursday morning and stood facing a building that should not have existed, was that some homes are built in secret, not out of deception, but out of a love so private and so careful that it refuses to exist anywhere near people who wouldn't understand it. The estate was not a mansion in the dramatic sense. It wasn't designed to intimidate or impress. It was large, substantially, quietly large, but its scale revealed itself gradually rather than announcing itself immediately, the way certain pieces of music don't show you their full complexity until you've been listening for several minutes. Stone exterior, dark timber framing, tall windows that caught the morning light and held it rather than reflecting it back. The grounds around it were maintained but not manicured. There was intention in the landscaping without the sterile perfectionism of something designed purely for appearance. Whoever had cared for this place had understood that it should look lived in, even when no one was living in it. Arthur produced a second key at the front door, larger, older, the kind that belongs to a lock built before digital convenience made physical craftsmanship feel unnecessary. The door opened into a wide entrance hall with stone floors and high ceilings, and the smell that met her was specific and immediate. Cedar, old paper, and something faintly floral that she couldn't identify but that settled over her like recognition. Not the recognition of a place she had visited. The recognition of a place that somehow already knew her. She moved through the room slowly, and Arthur followed at a respectful distance, offering no commentary, allowing her to take it in at her own pace. The sitting room held furniture chosen with an eye for comfort over aesthetics, deep chairs, warm textures, bookshelves built directly into the walls and filled with a kind of collected library that accumulates over decades rather than being purchased wholesale for decoration. She pulled one book from the shelf without thinking and opened the cover, and her hands stilled. Gerald's handwriting. A date. 16 years ago. A brief note in the margin of the first page that was too personal to be anything other than a record of a private moment. She closed the book carefully and put it back exactly where she'd found it. The kitchen was fully equipped, the pantry stocked with dry goods that had been recently replenished. Arthur confirmed that a local caretaking service maintained the property on a regular schedule, discreetly, under a management agreement that had been in place for nearly 2 decades. The bedroom held linens that had been laundered and pressed. The bathrooms were clean. Every room in this house had been kept in a state of quiet readiness, as if its owner had always believed that one day someone would arrive and need it to be exactly right. And then at the far end of the upper hallway, Margaret stopped. A single door, darker than the others, with a lock that matched neither of the keys Arthur had used. She tried the handle. It held firm. She turned to Arthur, and he reached into his jacket, the same interior pocket where the first key had lived, and this time produced not a key but a small sealed envelope with her name written on the front in handwriting she would have recognized anywhere, in any context, under any circumstances. Gerald's handwriting. Her name. And beneath it, 3 words that made every carefully maintained composure she had constructed over the previous 2 weeks begin, very quietly, to come apart at the edges. Only for you. Arthur took a small step back. He said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that the envelope hadn't already said better. Have you ever held something in your hands and known, before you opened it, before you read a single word, that whatever was inside was going to permanently reorder the way you understood your own life? Not with dread, not with excitement exactly, but with the particular gravity of a moment that has been moving toward you for a long time without your knowledge, arriving now with the quiet inevitability of something that was always going to happen, always going to find you, always going to choose this exact moment to finally land? Margaret stood in the upper hallway of a house she hadn't known existed 48 hours ago, holding an envelope addressed in her dead husband's handwriting, and felt exactly that. She opened it standing up, because sitting felt like a concession she wasn't ready to make. Inside was a single folded sheet and a second, smaller key, brass, newer than the door it was apparently meant for, with a paper tag attached that read Room 4 in Gerald's careful print. She unfolded the sheet. It was not a letter in the conventional sense. It was 4 sentences. She read them once, then again, then a third time, because the simplicity of them made her distrust her own comprehension. Margaret, everything in this room is yours and has always been yours. I should have told you sooner. I was afraid of the wrong things for too long. 4 sentences. 31 years. She folded the paper back along its original crease, placed it in her coat pocket against her chest, and walked to the 4th door. The room was a study. Not large, intimate, almost deliberately so, with a single desk positioned to face a window that looked out over the back grounds where the trees grew tallest and oldest. The desk held a lamp, a blotter, and a wooden box the size of a shoebox, unlocked, its lid slightly raised as if it had been left mid-thought. But it was the walls that stopped her completely. Floor to ceiling, on 3 sides of the room, were shelves, and on those shelves, arranged in dated sequence with the methodical care of someone who understood that order is a form of love, were letters. Hundreds of them. Bundled in groups, labeled by year, spanning. She scanned the dates and felt the floor shift slightly beneath her, spanning 26 years. She took the earliest bundle. 1998. She and Gerald had been married 7 years. She selected a letter at random, sat in the desk chair, and began to read. They were letters Gerald had written to her. Written, stamped in some cases, and never sent. Not unsent out of cruelty or indecision, but, as became clear within the first 3 she read, unsent because Gerald had not known how to say certain things aloud without what he called the wrong people turning them into something smaller. He had written to her about the family, about the specific, grinding way they had treated her from the beginning, not in the explosive language of grievance, but in the precise, detailed observations of a man who had watched quietly for decades and recorded what he saw with the accuracy of someone who knew the record mattered even if he never showed it to anyone. He had written about his mother's pearl earrings and what it had cost him to watch Margaret's face at that funeral. He had written about the savings she had contributed to rescue his practice. He had known, had always known, had never forgotten, had simply not known how to repay it in a currency equal to what it had meant. But it was the letters from the last 4 years that changed everything. Because in those letters, Gerald explained the estate. He had begun purchasing the land, he wrote, after a family meeting Margaret had not been invited to, a meeting at which, he had discovered afterward, certain members of his family had discussed what would happen to his assets when he died, and had assumed, with a confidence that had sickened him, that Margaret would receive nothing of consequence because they intended to ensure it. He had said nothing at that meeting. He had come home, kissed her on the cheek, and called Arthur Pendleton the following morning. He had spent 4 years building something they could never touch. Something with her name on it in every document that mattered. And then he had placed it behind a locked door and written her 4 sentences and trusted that she would find her way to it. Margaret set the letter down on the desk. Outside the window, the oldest trees moved slowly in a wind she couldn't hear through the glass. She sat with what she now knew and felt it settle into her, not like a revelation, not like a shock, but like the last piece of something sliding into place after years of the picture being almost but not quite complete. Gerald had known. He had always known. And he had answered it in the only language that couldn't be interrupted. What if the most devastating moment of your public life was never meant to hurt you? What if it was engineered, precisely and legally and with extraordinary patience, to destroy the people who were planning to destroy you? What if the $20 wasn't an insult but a trap, and the people laughing in that conference room had walked into it with the cheerful confidence of people who had absolutely no idea the floor was about to give way beneath them? Margaret came downstairs to find Arthur Pendleton standing in the kitchen with 2 cups of tea he had quietly prepared while she was in the study. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, and he placed a second folder in front of her, thicker than the one he had read from at the will reading, its edges worn in the way of something that has been handled carefully over a long period of time. He did not open it immediately. He looked at her and asked if she was ready, and she told him she had been ready for 31 years without knowing it. He opened the folder. The document inside was a second will. Not a codicil, not an amendment, not a supplementary note attached to the original. A complete, separate, fully executed legal will, dated 14 months before Gerald's death, witnessed by 2 independent parties, notarized, and filed with a court registry in a jurisdiction specifically chosen because it operated on a different disclosure timeline than the one governing the estate the family had just divided. Arthur had not presented it at the first reading because the law governing this particular filing required a mandatory waiting period following the initial estate reading, a period that had elapsed, to the day, this Thursday morning. Gerald had known this. He had structured the entire sequence deliberately, precisely, with a kind of detailed legal knowledge that comes from 14 years of working closely with a very good attorney. Arthur walked her through it carefully. The hidden estate, the gates, the stone house, the cedar and paper smell, the walls of letters, was valued, with its land, its contents, and a series of associated private investments Gerald had built within the same holding structure over 22 years, at just under $4 million. She heard the number and sat with it for a moment without reacting, because the number itself was almost secondary to the architecture of what Gerald had built around it. The money was significant. The intention behind it was staggering. But it was the legal mechanism Gerald had chosen that made Arthur pause before explaining, and lean forward slightly, and speak with the measured precision of someone delivering the most important part of a very long story. Gerald had not simply hidden assets. He had constructed the $20 bequest in the original will with specific, documented legal purpose. In the jurisdiction governing his primary estate, a surviving spouse who received any inheritance, regardless of size, was considered to have accepted the terms of the will and waived certain rights to contest it. Gerald's family had known this. They had, Arthur confirmed with the careful neutrality of a man presenting facts rather than opinions, been advised of this by their own legal counsel prior to the will reading. They had expected Margaret to receive nothing, contest the will, and lose, because contesting would have been legally complicated, emotionally exhausting, and ultimately unsuccessful given the way the primary estate had been structured. The $20 had been their idea first. They had lobbied Gerald, in the final year of his life, to include a nominal bequest to Margaret specifically to trigger that legal mechanism. Gerald had listened. He had agreed. He had instructed Arthur to include it. And then he had gone home and made sure that everything they thought they were protecting themselves from was already safely, legally, and permanently beyond their reach. The $20 wasn't Gerald abandoning her. It was Gerald letting them believe they had one. It was the oldest, quietest, most devastating move on a board they didn't even know they were playing on. Give them exactly what they asked for, let them celebrate it publicly and on record, and ensure that their celebration was the last move they ever made in this particular game. Margaret looked at Arthur. Arthur looked at Margaret. Outside the kitchen window, the trees on the estate grounds stood in the particular stillness of a late autumn morning, and the house around them was warm and solid and completely, legally, entirely hers. She picked up her tea. She took a slow sip. And then, for the first time since Gerald died, for the first time in what felt like a very long time before that too, Margaret Calloway smiled. Not with triumph, not with bitterness, but with a deep and private recognition of a woman who had just fully met her husband for the very first time. There is a specific silence that falls over a room when information arrives that cannot be argued with, cannot be reframed, and cannot be undone. It is different from the silence of shock, different from the silence of grief, different from the loaded quiet of an argument that has paused to reload. It is the silence of people who have just understood, fully and without exit, that they have made a catastrophic miscalculation, and that every confident, celebratory, champagne emoji-punctuated step they took in the wrong direction has been witnessed, recorded, and is now permanent. Arthur filed the second will on Friday morning. By Monday, the Calloway family had lawyers. Margaret learned this not through a formal notification, but through a phone call from Raymond, Gerald's brother, the one who had received the lake house and had his phone out before Arthur finished closing his folders. Raymond called at 7:43 in the morning, which told her everything about his emotional state before he said a single word. People who call before 8 in the morning are not calling to negotiate. They are calling because they have spent the night building pressure, and the morning has given them the first socially acceptable window to release it. She answered because she had decided, somewhere on the drive back from the estate on Thursday, that she was done arranging herself around other people's comfort. Raymond's opening was not a question. It was a statement delivered at the volume of a question. He said there had clearly been some kind of mistake, that Gerald had not been well in his final months, that decisions made under those circumstances were not necessarily reflective of his true intentions, and that the family felt strongly that this matter should be resolved privately, between family members, before it went any further. Margaret listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she told him, in the same measured tone she had used at Gerald's mother's funeral when she smiled about the pearl earrings, that he was welcome to have his attorney contact Arthur Pendleton. Then she said goodbye and ended the call. Diane came in person. Of course Diane came in person. She arrived on Tuesday afternoon without calling ahead, which Margaret recognized immediately as a power move, the unannounced visit designed to catch someone off guard, to find them in an unprepared state, to conduct the conversation on terms that favor the person who chose the timing. Margaret had been having tea in the sitting room when she heard the knock, and she took 1 full minute to finish her cup before she answered the door. Diane stood on the front step with an expression that had clearly been composed in the car, sympathy layered over urgency, layered over the barely concealed agitation of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say 3 times on the drive over. She said she was worried about Margaret, that this whole situation must be so overwhelming, that Gerald would have wanted the family to come together. She used the word family 4 times in the first 90 seconds. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings about the will reading, that these things were always difficult, that nobody had meant anything by it. Margaret stood in her doorway and listened and watched Diane's eyes move, to the sitting room behind her, to the hallway, cataloging, assessing, the way they always had, the way they had done at every family gathering for 31 years, measuring what was there and what might be available and what could be claimed. Margaret felt none of the emotions she might have expected. No anger, no satisfaction, no residual hurt. Just a clear, clean clarity, the particular vision that comes when you finally see something for exactly what it is. She told Diane she appreciated the visit. She told her the estate matter was being handled through proper legal channels and that Arthur Pendleton's office would be in touch with any relevant parties as required. She told her to drive safely, and she closed the door with the same quiet, unhurried care with which she had always done everything, not with force, not with finality performed for effect, but with the simple, settled confidence of a woman closing the door to a room she no longer needed to enter. She stood in her hallway for a moment after the latch clicked. Outside she heard Diane's heels on the front path, then a car door, then an engine, then nothing. The house was quiet. Her house. The one Gerald had paid for with her savings and never acknowledged until a letter she read in a room behind a locked door at the end of a private road behind iron gates on a property worth just under $4 million. She walked back to the sitting room, sat down, and picked up her tea, which had gone cold. She drank it anyway. It was still good. People who have never experienced a sudden, complete reversal of fortune tend to imagine it as a loud event. A transformation announced by movement and noise and visible change. New clothes, new address, new version of yourself unveiled to the world with the energy of someone who has been waiting a long time to be seen. What they don't account for is the quieter reality, which is that when something genuinely significant shifts in a person's life, the first thing it changes is not the outside. It changes the inside. And the inside does its work slowly, privately, without any audience at all. Margaret spent the first week after the second will was filed doing almost nothing that would have looked significant from the outside. She walked in the mornings. She cooked meals she actually wanted to eat rather than meals sized and seasoned for someone else's preferences. She read 3 books she had been meaning to read for years and had never prioritized. She called her sister in Ohio, her own sister, her own family, the people who had known her before she was anyone's wife, and talked for 2 hours about nothing important and everything essential. She slept without the particular tension that grief installs in the body, and that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying until the night it finally lifted, and she woke the next morning feeling like herself in a way she hadn't in longer than she could accurately measure. Arthur called midway through the second week with the family's formal legal response. Their attorneys had reviewed the second will, the holding structure, the private investments, and the court filing, and had reached the conclusion that Margaret's legal position was, in their own words, unassailable. There would be no contest. Raymond had apparently been advised by his own counsel that proceeding would be expensive, time-consuming, and almost certainly unsuccessful. Gerald had been too precise, too patient, too legally thorough for any challenge to find meaningful purchase. The lake house remained Raymond's. The family's portion of the primary estate remained distributed as originally read. What was Margaret's, and the boundary between the two was clean and legally permanent. She made her decisions about the estate over the following month, not quickly and not under any pressure, in consultation with Arthur and a financial advisor he recommended, a woman named Claire who spoke plainly and listened more than she talked, which Margaret appreciated enormously. The stone house she decided to keep. Not immediately as a residence. Her own home held 31 years of daily life and she was not ready to leave it, but as something she would grow into at her own pace, on her own timeline, without anyone else's opinion about what that should look like. She had the caretaking arrangement formalized and the property registered properly in her name, and the first time she drove there alone, in her own car, on a morning in late November when the trees had gone fully bare and the iron gates swung open with the same resonant certainty she remembered from the first time, she sat in the driveway for a few minutes and simply looked at the house and let it be real. The letters she kept in the study exactly where Gerald had left them. She read them over the course of several weeks, not in sequence but in the order she felt ready for, some years easier than others, some letters requiring a day or 2 of distance before she returned to them. She did not read them with the purpose of making sense of everything Gerald had or hadn't said in 31 years of actual daily life. She read them as what they were, a parallel conversation, conducted in private, by a man who loved her in the complete and complicated way that real love actually works, which is to say imperfectly and sometimes sideways and occasionally in formats that only make full sense in retrospect. There were two family members she chose to contact personally. Not Raymond, not Diane. Gerald's youngest niece, a quiet girl of 23 named Sophie who had been at the will reading but had not laughed, had not whispered, had sat in the corner of the conference room with the particular stillness of someone who was uncomfortable with what was happening around her but too young and too uncertain to name it. Margaret called her, invited her for tea, and over 2 hours discovered a young woman of genuine warmth and almost no resemblance in character to the family that had produced her. She quietly ensured that Sophie received a portion of one of the smaller private investments, not an enormous sum, but enough to matter for someone at the beginning of her adult life. Sophie cried. Margaret handed her a tissue and changed the subject because gratitude, in her experience, is best received briefly and then redirected into something practical. The second person was Arthur Pendleton himself, whom she invited to the estate for dinner in December. She cooked in the kitchen that had been stocked and waiting, in a house that had been maintained for decades for exactly this kind of quiet, purposeful use. They ate and talked, and she asked him questions about Gerald that nobody else could answer, and he answered them carefully and completely, and by the end of the evening she understood her husband more fully than she had at any point during the 31 years she had lived alongside him. It was not a sad understanding. It was the kind that settles rather than stings, the recognition that you were known and chosen and planned for by someone who expressed love in the architecture of actions rather than the performance of words. She drove home that night through the dark, bare-treed roads with the heater running and the radio off, and she was not lonely. She was alone, which is an entirely different thing, and one she had, it turned out, more than enough within herself to fill. So let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with this question rather than answer it quickly, because the quick answer and the true answer are rarely the same thing. When you think about the people in your life who have loved you most completely, how many of them expressed it in ways you actually recognized at the time? How many of them were building something for you in quiet, in private, in the careful architecture of small, consistent actions that didn't announce themselves as love because they were too busy actually being it? And how many of those people did you fully see? Not the version of them that was easy to categorize, not the version that fit neatly into the role they occupied in your life, but the complete, complicated, private human being underneath. Margaret Calloway went back to the estate on a morning in early spring, 4 months after the iron gates had first swung open for her. The trees that had been bare in November were beginning again, tentative green at the ends of branches, the particular optimism of a season that arrives not with fanfare but with accumulation, one small leaf at a time. She walked the grounds alone, in no hurry, with nowhere else to be and no one else's timeline to accommodate. She had learned, in the months since Gerald's death, that unhurried is not the same as aimless, that moving through your own life at a pace you have chosen is not laziness or avoidance but something closer to the most honest form of self-possession a person can practice. She had been mocked for $20. She had sat in a room full of people who shared her last name and watched them dismiss 31 years of her life with a particular cruelty of people who believe their certainty is the same thing as their correctness. And she had said nothing, shown nothing, given them nothing they could use, not because she was weak, but because she already understood, somewhere beneath the grief and the exhaustion, what her mother had told her once in that small Ohio house when the heat went out in January and the situation looked considerably worse than it actually was. She had said, "The quietest person in the room is usually the one who knows something the rest of them don't." Gerald had known that about her. He had loved that about her. He had built $4 million of legal architecture around that quality specifically, trusting that when the moment came she would be exactly what she had always been, steady, unhurried, and impossible to rattle. He had been right. He had, it turned out, been right about her for 31 years. Here is what this story is not about. It is not about money, though the money was real and significant and life-changing. It is not about revenge, though justice arrived in a form so precise it could be mistaken for it. It is not even entirely about Gerald, though his love for Margaret, patient, private, structurally perfect, is the kind of love that makes you reconsider every assumption you've ever held about what devotion actually looks like in practice. This story is about what happens when a person refuses to perform their own diminishment, when they absorb the cruelty of a room and choose, quietly and without announcement, not to become it, when they trust, in the absence of any visible evidence that they should, that the life they have lived with integrity is not invisible, even when every person around them is behaving as though it is. The family moved on, as families do. Raymond kept the lake house and had the deck built. Diane kept the pearl earrings she had always wanted. The nephews and nieces distributed their portions and returned to their lives. None of them ever fully understood what had happened, not the legal mechanism, not the letters, not the 22 years of quiet preparation. They understood only that they had miscalculated, which is a much smaller and less instructive version of the truth. Margaret understood the whole of it. And understanding the whole of it, she did what Gerald had trusted she would do. She used it well, held it lightly, and wasted none of it on people who had already demonstrated, clearly and publicly and on record, exactly who they were. She stood at the edge of the estate grounds that spring morning where the property met the treeline, with new leaves coming in overhead and the iron gates closed behind her and $4 million of land and history and letters at her back, and she thought about a man who had reached for her hand in movie theaters out of pure habit, who had learned how she took her coffee in 3 days, who had spent 14 years building a legal instrument of love so precise that it could survive his own death and arrive, intact and uncontested, exactly where he had always intended it to land. She thought, I knew you. I just didn't know how much. And if you have watched this entire story unfold, if you have sat with Margaret through the conference room and the parking lot and the unmarked road and the iron gates and the room full of letters, then you already know the question I'm going to leave you with, because it has been underneath every single moment of this story from the very first word. Who in your life is building something for you right now, in quiet, that you don't yet know how to see? Don't answer quickly. Sit with it. And if this story moved something in you, if it made you think of someone, remember something, reconsider anything, then you already know what to do next. Share it with that person. Because some things, like Gerald always understood, are better delivered directly than left unsent.